Hi true crime lovers, my name is Morgana. Welcome to my channel. I'm super excited to start my very first YouTube series, and this channel is going to be about true crimes, murders, mysteries, serial killers, cold cases, etc. Today we are going to talk about a multiple murder case in Texas known as the Texas Killing Fields. The identity of the person or people responsible for these murders is still unknown. Now, the Texas Killing Fields, when I first heard about this case, it was very confusing to me because I'm not from here. I'm originally from upstate New York, but I live in the area where these murders occurred. And when I found out there were 30 bodies found in a Texas killing field, it didn't make sense that no one had found out who the serial killer is, because if there's all those bodies and they keep being dumped in the same spot, why aren't the police staking out that spot? So it turns out that because there are so many murders on this road that's called I-45, which is the main road from Houston to Galveston, it's a 50-mile stretch of road. And then along that road, multiple bodies were found. Now, there were 4 bodies found in an actual field. That's what's known as the Texas Killing Field. But since there were so many of them, they went ahead and included that whole 50-mile area as the Texas Killing Field. So some people actually call that stretch of highway the Highway of Hell. So today's case is just going to focus on those 4 unsolved murders in the actual killing fields. And those killing fields, like I said, are located in a small town called League City, Texas. It's a 25-acre plot of land that's about a mile off of the highway. And I have known about these when I moved here in '98. I'd heard about these murders, and I heard about the killing field, and I knew it was on this road in League City called Calder Road. But I drive the highway, and I always knew the general direction of where the fields were. I had no idea where they actually were. I just knew the area that they were. So my friend lived a couple towns over, and there's a lot of construction in the area on the highway, so she found a back way so we could get back and forth to each other's houses quicker. So she showed me the way and told me which way to go, and I kept driving on it, and she said it's a dirt road. Part of it goes from a road, then it's a paved road to a dirt road to another paved road. So when you get to the dirt road, it's really rough, it's really bumpy, full of potholes. Just go super slow, don't even put your foot on the gas. So I continued to take that road, and so did she, and that's the way we traveled to avoid all the construction. Well, one day she was talking to me, and she mentioned, going to the killing field, through the killing fields, and I said, "What are you talking about?" And she said, "Have you never heard of the Texas killing fields?" And I was like, "Yes, but I've never been there." And she said, "Yes, that's the way you drive." And I said, "What?" So the shortcut that she took me on was actually the unpaved road that was right where the killing fields are. So once I found out about that, every time I drove through that part of the road, it was really spooky. It was really eerie because I started to notice there is nothing around that area. Even back then, there was just trees. It was empty. You started going on the paved road, and you're kind of in a small neighborhood. There's houses around, and all of a sudden there's nothing. It was nothing but fields and grass and trees. And then you jump back onto a regular paved road. Well, now it's grown up. The area is developed. It's paved all the way through. There's houses, there's new neighborhoods, new houses, there's a church, and there's actually a little bit down the road, there's an elementary school that has been built there now. So, like I said, I drove that road, and I still do to this day. I drive on 45. It's the main highway to get, if you want to go north or south anywhere, you stay on 45. So, back when I moved here, my then future husband warned me, not to pull over on the side of the road, especially not at night during that small stretch like where the killing fields are, but really anywhere on that part of 45 from Houston to Galveston. He said, if you have to pull over, just try and make it into the next exit. And where there's a gas station or a convenience store, and it's more public area. And if someone tried to pull me over at night, say a police officer for whatever reason I was getting pulled over, to make the police officer follow me to the next exit. And I said, I didn't understand why. And he said, well, because they don't know who the murderer is of the bodies that have been found along the side of the road. And so in the area on the news, it was put out to the public to for your safety, especially women, but for yours, because that was especially women, because that's all the bodies that have been found were women. So if a police officer was to pull you over, to just pull to the next public spot if you don't feel safe, because they didn't have any idea of who the murderer was, and there was suspicion that maybe it was someone in authority, maybe it was someone in uniform, someone that, if you're getting pulled over, you would trust. And nothing ever came of that. There was never any suspects that was a police officer or anyone, any uniformed officer, but that was just ways to keep us safe and make us feel more safe while we were traveling, especially if we were traveling alone at night. It's been 22 years since I've lived here, and the identity of the murderer or murderers is still unknown, but there has been a recent development in the case of April of last year of 2019. And like I said, the killing fields are about a mile off of 45. And if you were in the fields, and you were to scream for help or scream, even though that freeway is right there, the interstate is right there, no one would hear you. Back then, there was nobody around. If you were to run, there was nowhere to run to that you could get too fast to get away for help. And there have been many detectives and FBI agents that have described that area. They investigated the case and described this area as the perfect way to get away with murder. You just go in, you can kill somebody, dump a body, and leave, and no one would ever know you were there. And like I said, I'm just going to focus on the 4 bodies that were found in the actual killing fields. All 4 bodies were found the same way. They were nude, they were all on their backs, they were all lying underneath a tree, and they all had their arms crossed over their chest. Because the bodies were placed 1,000 feet apart from each other, a detective that has investigated this case in this area many times thinks that the killer created a walking path for his trophies. So it's suspected that now we know more about serial killers and their patterns, and we know that they do like to put their bodies in a way that they treat them as their trophies, and they like to go back to the scenes of the crimes and walk around and look at their bodies, at their victims. Many police officers and detectives consider this a personal graveyard of a serial killer. Now, we don't know if this is the work of one serial killer or multiple serial killers, but there were a lot of similarities between the way the girls were killed, and there were also a lot of differences as well. Heidi Fye was a 23-year-old cocktail waitress who vanished on October 10th, 1983, while she was walking from her home to a convenience store to make a phone call. Now, I grew up in the 80s, and this was something that was very common. If our parents were on the phone, we would just walk up. I walked up the block to the gas station or the convenience store, and I would just use the payphone to call my friends. So back then, this was a very common thing to do. However, that was the last time Heidi was seen alive. The League City Police Department investigated at the time of her disappearance, and there were no clues to find where she went or who might have taken her. Her body was discovered by a dog digging up a skull and bringing it back to its house, which was a few hundred yards away, and dropping it at the foot of its owners. And actually, I read in a report that the dog dropped the skull at the feet of their toddler. The medical examiner determined her cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head. She was also beaten, had broken ribs, and beaten with what was written as a club. On February 3rd, 1986, 4 boys were riding their dirt bikes down Calder Road when they smelled a real foul smell. So they went out and tried to figure out if they could find the source of where this odor was coming from. This is when they ended upon the skeletal remains of a female body. It was determined that she died 6 weeks to 6 months prior to her body being discovered. She was shot in the back, and she was described as a 25-year-old female, 5'5" to 5'8", weighing 140 to 160 pounds, with long reddish-brown hair. And she also had a very distinct gap between her 2 front teeth. She was located just 50 yards away from where Heidi's body was found. Since there were no leads on a missing person described this way, the police called her Jane Doe. Now, there's been a recent development in this case that I'm going to get to a little bit later. However, while they were searching the area around Jane Doe's body looking for clues, they happened upon another female body. Laura Miller was a 16-year-old girl. On September 10th, 1984, she asked her parents' permission to go down to a convenience store to use the payphone to call her boyfriend. The family had just moved into the League City area, and the phone lines hadn't been set up at her house yet. Now, does this sound familiar? It should, because it is actually the same convenience store and the same payphone that Heidi used the last time she was seen alive. But at the time, the police didn't make that connection. And the date that Laura Miller disappeared was 11 months to the day from when Heidi Fide disappeared. Her dad, Tim Miller, which I'll get to his importance in a little bit, called the police to report her missing. But the police reported her as a runaway or a possible suicide. Now, the reason they did that is because Laura had a known history of mental health problems. Laura suffered from seizures, which she had to take daily medication for. And the first thing Laura Miller's parents did was call the local hospitals to see if anyone that fit her description has brought in, because they thought maybe she had a seizure on her way to the store or while she was at the store, and she was just taken immediately to the hospital. But after checking all the hospitals in the area, there was no one there that fit her description. Unfortunately, 17 long months passed before the Millers would find out what happened to their 16-year-old daughter, Laura. 5 years after Laura Miller and Jane Doe's bodies were found, the fourth body was discovered on September 8, 1991. This body was discovered by people riding by on horseback, and it was only 100 yards away from where the other 3 bodies were found. This girl was called Janet Doe because there were no leads on anyone missing that fit her description. Janet Doe had died 1 to 4 months prior to her body being discovered. She was about 31 years old, 5'1" to 5'3", 100 to 120 pounds, with long brown hair. Her cause of death appeared to be being beaten by a club, just like Heidi Fye, and possibly strangled with a cord. The identity of whoever killed these girls, whether it was one person, multiple people, or a copycat, has never been discovered. And there hasn't been any evidence pointing in one direction or the other, which made finding suspects for these cases really difficult. There was one man who became an unlikely suspect, and his name was Robert Abel. He became a suspect in 1993 because he lived locally in the area. He was a retired NASA engineer. But what made him a person of interest is because during the time of the murders, he leased a horse stable adjacent to where the bodies were found in those fields. His third wife went to the League City Police Department to report him as a suspect because she said that he beats his horses with a metal pipe. And we know that 2 of the victims, their cause of death was being beaten by a blunt force object. The police looked into him, and during an interview, he said that there was no way he could have done this because he had a rotator cuff injury. He said there was no way he could have shot one of the girls, put her in the car, driven out there, and dumped the body. Now, this detailed account, as what Robert Abel described as something there was no way he could have done, was very suspicious to the police because there were so many details involved. The police tried to find any evidence they could to link him to any of the murders along I-45, not just the 4 bodies found in the killing field, but there was never any evidence, there was never any way to tie him to any of the crime scenes. Robert Abel became an outcast in his community, and parents and kids were afraid of him. He was listed as a possible suspect in the newspapers and on TV, so if parents were out in public places, like, and they saw him at a grocery store, they would hide their kids behind their back. Tim Miller was convinced that Robert Abel was his daughter's killer, even though no charges were ever brought upon him. Even though Robert Abel was never charged with any crimes, and he was found innocent of these crimes. The damage to his psyche was already done. And he moved out of the area, moved to a different town, and he drove his tractor onto railroad tracks as a train was approaching. Some thought it was suicide, but his cause of death actually was listed as an accident. Tim Miller decided that the police weren't doing enough to help find clues and to help identify who killed his daughter. So he contacted the owner of the land, and he leased it from them for $10 a year while he combed every inch of the land looking for any clues, any evidence that maybe the police hadn't found. He made finding his daughter's killer his life mission, and this mission has led him to find many others in his community as well as across the country. In the year 2000, he founded the Texas EquiSearch, which is an all-volunteer-based nonprofit search and rescue group. Texas EquiSearch has assisted local law enforcement agencies across the country as well as in other countries finding missing individuals. Now, there's a lot of little towns and cities in between that 50-mile stretch of Houston and Galveston, and those law enforcement agencies didn't necessarily communicate between each other when these bodies were found. Because they didn't share information, this made finding any suspects even more difficult. A body found in one town didn't necessarily relay information to the police department in the next town. So there didn't seem to be a coordinated effort to stop and get in front of these abductions which have been led to murders. In fact, up until April of 2019, last year, the identities of Jane and Janet Doe have never been identified. That is until the League City Police Department said they learned the women's identities through a genetic genealogy database. And through their family members, they identified Jane Doe as Audrey Cook, and they identified Janet Doe as Donna Prudhomme. Audrey Cook was a 30-year-old mechanic, and Donna Prudhomme was a mother of two. The discovery of these victims' identities is the first development that this case has had in years. And the police are very hopeful that now the women have been identified, maybe someone will remember something, and they will come forward with more tips to help this case. I find it so sad that these murders have not been solved yet, and these parents, these families have not had any closure yet. So much time has passed, and I'm so hopeful that the police have information that they don't share with the public. I'm sure that's what the police do. They don't release everything, all the details out into the public. So I'm just hoping that there has been evidence, or they maybe have another suspect and they just haven't brought it out into the public yet because they just don't have entirely enough to go on. So hopefully with identifying these two, maybe that will lead to more tips. Now, I thought I would end on this note. About 5 months after Robert Abel died, that was who Tim Miller suspected was his daughter Laura Miller's murderer, Tim received a letter in the mail. Now, this wasn't just any regular letter. It looked like the kind of ransom letters that you've seen where they're cut, the letters are all uppercase, lowercase mixed up. They're cut out of magazines or newspapers and glued on. There's different sizes and different fonts. And the letter starts out with, "Tim Miller Boo, it's me you're looking for. You've not seen me, but I'm the last man to see your daughter Laura and many more, and the police won't find me, for I am too smart and I tampered with evidence." And this letter goes on to imply that he is taking responsibility for not just Laura Miller's murder, but also for several along I-45. Tim Miller said this was a very strange and disturbing letter, but we'll never know if there's any truth to it. There was never another letter sent. The author didn't provide any specific details about any of the crimes. The writer of this letter has never been identified, and there have never been any more letters sent that the police has made public anyway. As I was researching about these four women, I realized there was not a whole lot of information out there. The two that were just identified, Audrey Cook and Donna Prudhomme, there isn't a whole lot out there, and it's been since April of last year, and nothing more has come forward. The only thing I could find was Audrey Cook is not from this area. She is from Tennessee. So I think that they listed her as a missing person up there, but it didn't spread down here to Texas, so they didn't know to look for her outside of the state. And then Donna Predholm is a mother of two. Now, I read that the grandparents of her two kids were raising them, but I don't know if they were raising them before she disappeared or since she disappeared. I just find it strange that Donna wasn't reported missing way back then, so there was nothing to fit her appearance, and they had to rely and wait for our technology to advance and become more developed in order to make a DNA match to her family. I'm also hopeful that even though these cases were 37 years ago, that as our technology becomes more advanced and we get the word out about these cases, that maybe people will come forward, things that they forgot or things that they remember seeing now. There haven't been any new killings along I-45 since those back then, and so that leads me to believe that maybe the killer is dead, or maybe since we don't know if it's one or multiple, maybe one's dead, maybe one has been charged and found guilty and in jail of something else. Maybe one of the other murders that occurred along I-45, they admitted to that murder, and even though they're in jail, they've just never fessed up to any of the murders in the actual killing fields. I don't know. Thank you guys so much for being here and listening to these cases. Please let me know your feelings about these cases in the comments below. I'm really looking forward to sharing and talking about more cases with you all. If you like this video and want to see more of it, please don't forget to hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to keep updated and be the first to know when a new video comes out, be sure to hit that bell. Until next time, stay sweet, stay kind, and stay safe. Bye, y'all.